Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Putting a Price on Sustainable Aviation Fuel. This event is part of SAF Magazine's webinar series, and it is presented by OPIS, a Dow Jones company. Regarding today's discussion, OPIS Biofuels Director Jordan Godwin will discuss the evolving SAF landscape, including the latest news developments in the industry's buildout and how SAF producers can utilize every opportunity available to ensure success. He will explore market dynamics behind the SAF tax credits, low carbon fuel standard programs, and federal renewable identification number credits that are all key in incentivizing sustainable growth for SAF in the years to come. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but may submit a question at any time. As your moderator, I'll be collecting these questions as they are received. We'll conduct a live Q&A following Mr. Godwin's presentation, and any questions not answered during the Q&A, we will ensure he receives them to follow up post-webinar. A recording of the webinar will be available after the event at safmagazine.com under the Events tab. Before we begin today's event, we have a special message from our webinar sponsor.
OPIS, a Dow Jones company, delivers energy commodity pricing, news, and analysis in real time across the global supply chain so that stakeholders can better understand complexities and complete transactions with confidence in a market undergoing rapid transition. We have market-leading brands providing full coverage of the global fuel supply chain. These include OPIS, a Dow Jones company, which covers crude and refined oil products, feedstocks, renewable fuels, carbon credits, and environmental commodities. Chemical Market Analytics covers olefins and derivatives, aromatics and fibers, plastics and polymers, inorganics, and syngas. PetroChemWire covers NGLs, monomers, polymers, and chemical feedstocks. McCloskey covers coal, metals, and mining. Access covers integrated fuel management. OPIS data and news span the globe, from our fuel price benchmarks in North America to wholesale rack prices in Mexico, cargo shipments in Europe, coal mining in South Africa, chemical production in Asia, and petrol stations in Australia.
All right, without further ado, let's get started. Now presenting, we have Jordan Godwin, Director of Renewables at OPIS. Jordan, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Right, thank you so much, Anna, and thank you so much to SAF Magazine and BBI International for having OPIS and hosting us on this webinar series. I'm really excited. I've enjoyed working with all the folks at BBI International for over a decade, whether it's on the editorial side and reading the fantastic news pieces that you guys put out on not only on the website but also in the magazines that get mailed to me. I love sifting through those. I had a guest column. I was very honored to be able to write a guest column in SAF Magazine, the most recent issue. So that was pretty cool, and I've always enjoyed attending the BBI International events. It's really a really cool place to be in the industry, and it's where everyone's at. So I'm thrilled that we're doing this webinar today. And I'm thrilled to have all of you attendees here joining us. There's nearly 300 people online right now. We had nearly 750 registrations, which apparently is, if it's not an all-time record for this webinar series, it's pretty close apparently. So very excited that you chose to register and hear what we have to say about sustainable aviation fuel. There's no doubt that there's tremendous interest in sustainable aviation fuel, and I'm happy to share what we know about it. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be covering in the presentation, we're going to be talking about putting a price on sustainable aviation fuel, and that's something that we at OPIS have been kind of trying to crack the code on for a few years now, all building up to the launch of our daily sustainable aviation fuel price assessments in December of 2023, so a few months ago now. But this presentation is going to start at a very high level. We're going to start it out with a very 101 level overview of we're going to talk about the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, the Renewable Fuel Standard, LCFS credits, RIN credits, all the various components that go into the price, the value of sustainable aviation fuel. And we're also going to be talking a lot about renewable diesel, especially early on in this presentation, because the way I see it, renewable diesel is kind of the older sibling of SAF. It's kind of going through a lot of the same growing pains, or it has over the past 5 or 10 years, gone through a lot of changes and evolutions as the production capacity has really ramped up, and it's made a tremendous impact in a lot of different areas. So it's in my perspective, I think renewable diesel has really paved the way for sustainable aviation fuel, but there's still a lot of obstacles and hurdles that remain for SAF to really get up and really take off. Thanks to the opening slide, it kind of introduced OPIS a little bit, but in case you're not familiar with us, we're a price reporting agency under the Dow Jones umbrella, where we've been for about 2 years now. But OPIS has been around for nearly 50 years. We cover a wide range of fuels and transportation markets, and within the editorial group sits our renewables team, which I manage. So on that biofuels team, we've got fantastic reporters with extensive experience in biofuels markets, and they include Spencer Kelly, Michael Schneider, who've both been covering renewable fuels for more than 2 decades. We've got Patrick Newcommett, who covers our policy side of things. Aaron Alford, who's kind of our primary RINs reporter and has written quite a bit on SAF as well. And MK Bauer, who serves as our primary reporter on those newly launched renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel price assessments. So like I said, it takes a team to put this kind of thing out, and I'm just kind of the spokesperson, if you will, to talk about these efforts. So at OPIS, our reporters are in the trenches. We're communicating throughout the trading day with market participants with the ultimate daily goal of providing the most fair, accurate, and transparent price assessments and news coverage of these markets. We've got subscribers in all corners of the transportation value chain, from refiners to wholesalers, retailers, traders, biofuels producers, and many, many more facets of fuels markets. Our prices are often referenced in industry contracts as a neutral third party between buyers and sellers of fuels. And a little bit later, I'm going to tell you more about how the industry is currently utilizing some of our biofuels assessments in a big way. So in a nutshell, when people ask me what do I do, what does OPIS do, we essentially talk to the buyers and sellers. We have contacts on both sides who have kind of a rooting interest in where our daily price assessments are settled every day. And, we have buyers who maybe have more incentive for the price to be lower. So maybe they tell us, hey, the price should be $2 today. And we have sellers that want the price to be higher and they can make plenty of margin. And they say, no way, it should be $3. So we just call it $2.50. We do a lot of, to use the old phrase, split the baby. We use that a lot around OPIS. Now, our bread and butter is price reporting, but we also do a ton of news reporting. So if you've ever had any trouble finding information on renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel, I'm guessing you aren't subscribed to us, because we cover these fuels like nobody's business. We wrote over 700 stories last year about renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel, which was nearly triple what we did, just 4 years prior, when these fuels were really starting to heat up. So clearly we've had a lot to write about, and there's been a lot of projects announced in this space. a lot of promises made by airlines, as they set their respective goals of trying to blend more sustainable aviation fuel into their fuel supply, and we've been all over it, writing stories. Last year, between these two fuels, we probably wrote 3 or 4 stories a day, on average. So if you're not a regular around biofuels, if you're new to the space, you have to know that there are a lot of acronyms around biofuels. So if you're not familiar, go ahead and hurry up and commit all these to memory in case I drop any letters in this presentation. For example, someone might say something like, OHO has really pressured RINs and subsequent RVO values under the RFS lately, and that's affecting high CI, RD, under carbs, LCFS efforts. We go through a lot of letters in biofuels, but don't worry. By the end of this presentation, you'll be an acronymable acrobat just like the rest of us. So one important thing to understand about biofuels is that they're very policy driven. So a common goal of these policies is to reduce greenhouse gas GHG emissions and hopefully lower the impact of our transportation has on the environment. So depending on a wide variety of factors, biofuels are generally better for the environment than traditional fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel, but the extent of how much better they are for the environment has been widely debated over the last couple of decades. That was especially the case with the Renewable Fuel Standard, which was established in 2005. It's been around nearly 20 years and is overseen by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. So under the RFS, EPA sets volume-based targets that require refiners and importers of gasoline and diesel to blend a certain amount of biofuels like ethanol and biodiesel, as well as other emerging biofuels like renewable natural gas, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel, which is incentivized, but it isn't currently required under the RFS just yet. So the way the RFS works is if you don't have the infrastructure, if you're an obligated party, that being a refiner or an importer of gasoline and or diesel, you either have to prove that you're blending biofuels at the percentage target that the EPA sets out, or you need to go out into the marketplace and buy these credits called RINs, the Renewable Identification Number credits. And those RINs have become a pretty fun commodity to themselves that OPIS has been tracking for a while. And we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. So on the right of this slide, we have the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, that's the LCFS, which came along about 6 years after the RFS started. So under the LCFS, the California Air Resources Board assigns carbon intensity scores to every fuel and targets increasingly stringent GHG reductions in California's transportation fuel pool. So fuels above the target for that given year generate deficits, and fuels below the target generate credits, meaning a refiner churning out gasoline and diesel in California may need to buy credits to offset those deficits to remain compliant. So California is currently in a rulemaking process to increase the near-term stringency of the targets. They just had a major meeting workshop yesterday where they went over their latest iteration of what they're thinking for these rulemaking modifications. And there's a lot of people involved providing feedback. Obviously, stakeholders on all sides, all angles of these fuels want the program to incentivize and function in a way that helps their companies. So it's been a really interesting process to see them try and fine tune this program. And for this presentation, we'll be talking a lot about California's LCFS program because it's been kind of the main thing driving the growth of renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. But it's important to know that there are other programs like the California LCFS that are already established, and there are more coming. So British Columbia started its LCFS program in 2013, Oregon joined California as the second state to launch its own version of the program called the Clean Fuels Program in 2016. The state of Washington and Canada established their own programs that launched in 2023, last year. And now there are a handful of states taking a serious look at adopting similar programs in legislative sessions this spring. So maybe a little more than a month ago, New Mexico passed the LCFS program. So they're going to be the first state outside of this sort of West Coast collaborative along the West Coast of the United States and Canada. They're the first state to establish an LCFS program as well. And I think Illinois is looking at it, New Jersey's looking at it, Minnesota. So there's a lot of other prospects for emerging markets. And when there are more LCFS programs, there's going to be more demand for low carbon fuels like sustainable aviation fuel. So I think this illustration provides a good visual for beginners of how an LCFS program works. This comes from the California Air Resources Board. So I want to extend appreciation to their staff and all they do in this space, because they've got a pretty tall task in paving the way with this LCFS program. They've got a lot of very opinionated stakeholders who, rightfully so, have, are in the ear of CARB, and it's been a really interesting policy, kind of discussion to be a part of and to monitor as a journalist and cover it and write news stories about it. So like I mentioned earlier, fuels below the target compliance line generate credits, and fuels above that target line generate deficits. So for example, this year in 2024, the program targets a 12.5% CI reduction from the 2010 baseline, which is a CI score of about 87. So gasoline and diesel typically hold scores around 100. So to get that average score to this year's target around 87, you have to blend lower CI fuels. So for fuels like renewable diesel, which typically gets a CI score of around 40, you're going to be generating a lot of credits. More on that in a minute. So this graphic illustrates how the program has performed since 2011, well, up through 2022. So as you can see, in the first 10 years or so of the program, the green line, which is the reported CI reduction, so that's the average CI score of the fuels in California throughout the span of this graph. That green line stayed pretty dang close to the annual compliance targets. Basically, low carbon fuels were just barely scraping by. We were just barely blending enough of them to ensure that we were producing enough credits to remain compliant. But then you notice that green line really started to nosedive around 2021, when we started generating way more credits than deficits. It was around a 12.5% reduction in 2022, and 2023 was roughly 15 to 20%. And 2024 will be even higher than that. It's anybody's guess what our current average target is at the moment. We don't have the data for the first 4 months yet, but it's probably going to be around 20 to 25%, well ahead of this year's target of 12.5%. So you can kind of see where there's a slight slowly developing problem in that we're generating way more credits than deficits. But what's been the impact of that? Just how many more credits than deficits did we generate to rapidly accelerate the carbon reductions? A lot. This chart shows what it looks like when the market is overperforming at the level that it has been for the last few years. So if you squint a little bit there at the bottom, the columns of blue and red at the bottom of the screen represent credits generated, those are in blue, and deficits generated in red. So the program got off to a good start the first few years. Blue was just barely slightly outpacing red. You know, you see on the far left of this chart, there's relatively small amount of credits being generated, but also a relatively low amount of deficits being generated, because in the early years, you know, the percent reduction was much less stringent than it is now at 12.5%. So in the first few years, it was 1%, 3%, 5%, what have you. So we got off to a good start, but you can see that over the past few years, that dynamic has certainly shifted. So the green line in this chart represents the cumulative credit bank. So that's how many credits we've generated that don't really have a compliance home. You know, everyone's already met their compliance. They bought enough LCFS credits to prove that they're compliant under the program. And this green line represents, you know, those extra credits that are just kind of saved up in this imaginary bank that didn't really get reported to a compliance home. So every quarter, you see over the course of the program's history, there were a little bit more credits than deficits, slowly building that cumulative credit bank of excessive credits that weren't really needed for compliance. Then in that 2016 to 2021 period, it really started to level out and even tighten a bit. You can see that green line dipping a little bit lower. And around that time, people were starting to get pretty concerned about compliance, and the cost of those compliance credits, those LCFS credits, hit all-time highs over $200 per credit, which started to translate into meaningful costs for consumers at the pump, you know, sometimes pushing over 20 cents per gallon. As an aside, anyone who has ever driven in California knows Californians barely notice 20 cents per gallon when their gas is typically $1 or $2 more expensive than most of the rest of the US, but that's a completely different webinar. Back to this cumulative credit bank that we're talking about here. So you see in 2021, it really started to tail upwards sharply higher and higher, because we were generating way more credits than deficits. So you see those blue lines, the columns at the bottom really start to look like skyscrapers compared to the deficits that were being generated. We were making way more credits than we needed to prove compliance. So that credit bank topped 20 million credits by the end of the third quarter of last year, the most recent data we have from CARB. So who's been generating all these credits the past couple of years? You guessed it, renewable diesel. You can see here that renewable diesel, represented by the teal line, trailed ethanol and biodiesel early on before becoming the dominant credit generating fuel around 2020. COVID actually played a small role in renewable diesel's overnight arrival on the scene, as more people were staying at home, putting a 15 to 30% dent in gasoline demand. People weren't out driving on the roads, but they were still picking up groceries and ordering stuff off Amazon Prime. So diesel demand never really made a substantial decline in 2020, providing plenty of need for renewable diesel. And by the end of last year, credit generation topped 3 million credits per quarter, and we're nowhere near the peak of all this. More on that in a little bit. First, let's take a look at the market impact of all this renewable diesel production and credit generation. So if you recall a few slides ago, things got a little dicey in that 2016 to 2021 period, and that's when credits hit their peak. You can see in those years, they hovered pretty closely under that $200 per credit mark. And the California Air Resources Board got so nervous about the price spike that they actually had to implement a credit price cap in 2021. But as the renewable diesel volumes started to pick up steam, those credit prices really started to tumble. Remember that green line there in the last couple of years, how it really kind of hockey sticked higher. You're seeing a direct inverse correlation reflection of that in the price of the credits here over the last few years. So the past few months, we've been seeing credits trade around $60 per credit. That's, more than 5-year lows, levels that we haven't seen in a long time. And the market is just simply awash in credits. The bank is overflowing, and compliance under the current targets will be way too easily achievable for years to come. Like I said, last year we were 15 to 20% performing when the target was only 10%. And this year we're going to be around 20, maybe even 25%, and the target's only 12.5%. So that's why the California Air Resources Board has decided to step in, proposing to increase the stringency of the program's targets, among other things. So this gives you an idea, I think, of what they talked about at a workshop a few months ago. Currently, the program represented in the black line only targets a 20% reduction from that 2010 baseline. And like I said, we're pretty much already there at this point. And CARB has a tall task ahead of itself to try and put in new targets, essentially. And those changes feature, currently what's being proposed, those changes feature a new 30% CI reduction by 2030 compared to that current target of 20%. And it also proposes a 90% CI reduction target by 2045. So you see, we're really ahead of schedule right now, but we're still light years away from a 90% CI reduction. But that definitely, if once they're able to pass this, that'll definitely provide the market with, 20 years of certainty and pretty lofty goals of reducing GHG emissions in the 2030s and 2040s. So it's definitely expected to have a market impact on those LCFS credits. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the next year or two, but in the next 3 to 5 years, I think most people are expecting that credit price to recover quite a bit from where it's at now, around $60 per credit. That increased stringency also that CARB has proposed has also includes a step change in 2025 that basically updates the compliance schedule from a CI reduction of the target of 13.75%. That's what we're currently at for 2025. They're going to update that to an 18.75% reduction. And there's also been this step down mechanism that they've really talked a lot about, basically saying if you're already ahead, if you meet certain thresholds of overperformance for the program, it's going to trigger basically a fast forward of the compliance schedule by about 5 years. The way I keep thinking about it, it's like if your kid is in first grade and they're already reading, I don't know, advanced literature and doing calculus or whatnot. That's basically where the program's at today, and that the program is essentially suggesting that first grader should be skipping to high school or maybe even college. But maybe a silly analogy, but it's just the way I've been thinking about it in terms of how that step down acceleration mechanism is going to work. So that is just kind of an overview of where we're at with the LCFS program. It's really important to kind of get this background and to understand what that all means, and we'll kind of put a bow on it later, and I'll explain more why that's important for sustainable aviation fuel in just a few more slides. So first I wanted to just kind of give a little slide and an overview of renewable diesel. So I'm a journalist, I'm not a chemist or an engineer, so we won't be getting too in the weeds here, but the important takeaway is that renewable diesel can be produced a lot of different ways and can be made from a very wide variety of different feedstocks. And the most important takeaway for this webinar's purposes is that it's nearly identical to traditional diesel. so it can be blended up to 100% in diesel engines with no issues. And the same goes for sustainable aviation fuel. It's chemically identical to traditional jet fuel. It may look a little different, as you can see in the in these different pictures here, and but it's going to perform the exact same way, and it's going to be a lot safer than you know, putting a commercial airliner on a battery anytime soon. So I don't think you know, commercial airliners are anywhere near electrification. So that's why sustainable aviation fuel is going to be incredibly important for decades to come. So at this one, this slide is just showing you the rapid growth of renewable diesel production capacity in the US. Production topped 1 billion gallons for the first time in 2021, and then it just about doubled that last year, around 3 billion gallons, and it may very well double that again a few years from now. The latest projections I've seen have US production capacity around 7 billion gallons per year in 2030. So that's going to mean a lot of credit generation, a lot of product, you know, entering the marketplace. And if this continues, renewable diesel will continue to be kind of the primary driver of credit generation. But this also is a good illustration to show the potential that sustainable aviation fuel could have as well. How fast a market can really grow up overnight if it's properly incentivized. If the incentives make sense and the margins make sense for the refiners, then they're going to make the fuel that makes the most sense for their bottom line. And that's certainly what we've seen in renewable diesel. And it's something that we expect to see from sustainable aviation fuel over the next couple of years. So looking at our next slide here, this gives you an illustration of our RIN prices. So it's really important to know that these prices of RINs, that's under the RFS, the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, they've kind of followed a similar path as the LCFS credits. So the renewable diesel feedstocks have been relatively cheap, and diesel prices have stayed pretty stubborn around the levels that they're at. So it currently makes a whole lot more sense to produce and blend renewable diesel than it does to spend, you know, $2 on RIN credits like we were seeing in 2021. So remember how I told you RIN prices have really had an interesting journey over the last 15 years, and this is what I was talking about. It's been a rags to riches and back to rags story for our beloved RIN credits since their inception. You can see in that period from 2018 to 2021 or so, there was a big dip in the cost of those compliance credits, and a lot of that had to do with how the Trump administration dealt with the enforcement of the program, mainly through the small refinery exemptions. So they gave a lot of exemptions in those years, and it really wiped out 10 to 20% of the obligation of the overall market. So we needed 10 to 20% less RINs. There were a lot more RINs out there. There was a flood of RIN credits. That cumulative RIN bank, similar to what we discussed with LCFS earlier, really swelled, and it was way too easy to comply with the program. And then once the Supreme Court found that, you know, that the way they were doing the small refinery exemptions didn't make sense, you saw the price recover over the past couple of years. But we've seen it go back down over the past 6 months or so, and a lot of that has had to do with the large amount of renewable diesel coming online and basically making a lot more RIN credits and making it a lot easier to comply with the RFS. So just keep in mind, you know, LCFS credits, you saw that they used to be very healthy around the same time that these RIN credits were very healthy, at all-time highs, $200 per credit for LCFS, $2 per RIN on this side. And that's when a lot of that market activity and investment really started to be made in renewable diesel, bringing more and more production online. Obviously, when these credits are at this level, the producers are making margins of anywhere from $2, maybe even $3 per gallon. So it made a lot more sense to produce renewable diesel. You saw a lot of diesel refiners even switch from traditional fossil fuel diesel production to renewable diesel. If the incentive is there, they're going to make those decisions. And the same goes for sustainable aviation fuel. If the market says there's more incentive to produce sustainable aviation fuel than renewable diesel, there are ways that they can adjust their production to produce SAF instead of renewable diesel. So that could be an interesting dynamic that really comes into play over the next 5 or 10 years as refiners try to make sure they're producing the fuel that's going to bring them the healthiest margin. So that's pretty much a high-level overview of where we're at with renewable diesel. In summary, we've seen incredible growth practically overnight, and it was spawned from the incentives provided by LCFS and RINs. But renewable diesel's success has ultimately ended up wreaking havoc on the LCFS program as a whole. Those LCFS credit values, feedstock soybean oil futures, RIN prices, and ultimately renewable diesel margins, which were the reason this whole thing started in the first place. It's kind of the biofuels circle of life. Their policy comes into place where there's incentivized production of these biofuels and blending demand coming online, and the margins are very strong early on, but then markets are efficient, they find their ways, and those incentives kind of start to wither away over the past couple of years. So now let's turn to sustainable aviation fuel. Like I said, sometimes I like to think of renewable diesel as kind of a child prodigy who just started kindergarten and can already play Beethoven symphonies on the piano and violin, and will also play in the NBA one day. If that's the case, we're still sort of pregnant with sustainable aviation fuel, if you will. It's not quite available and around yet. It hasn't quite been born yet. We're producing it at very small volumes. We'll talk about that on the next slide. It's got all the same wonderful properties that make it a very attractive fuel of the future, but it's still a few years away, and it still needs a lot of help to get it out of those infancy stages. It's also probably got a longer shelf life than renewable diesel, considering we're a lot closer to electrifying our heavy-duty truck fleet in the US than we are commercial airliners. So sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, is just like traditional jet fuel and has been demonstrated to run planes on 100% blends. I think just a few months ago, they've demonstrated the first flights, first transatlantic flights on 100% SAF blends. It's been tested over and over. It's ready to go. It's just not being produced at the commercial scale where it can make a real impact just yet. Plus, a little known fact, it's actually inspired graphic designers to come up with some very fun illustrations. If you Google image sustainable aviation fuel, you get a lot of very interesting illustrations, and they're kind of fun to look at. A lot of leaves involved, but I picked 3 of my favorite on here just to provide some color for this presentation. Similar with renewable diesel, SAF is produced through various different processes: hydrotreating, gasification, and pyrolysis. You can use a lot of different feedstocks to make it, including soybean oil, used cooking oil, tallow, a whole bunch of different edible oils or waste fats, as well as ethanol. There's a major push to produce SAF through the alcohol to jet ATJ pathway. I don't think that one was on my acronym slide, but ATJ is going to be a big one as more ethanol producers seek to make their product a feedstock for SAF production. So there's a lot of different ways you can make it. So looking at this slide, this gives you an idea of how small global SAF production is currently. So last year in 2023, it was about 160 million gallons. That did double 2022's total. And it's expected to more than triple this year in 2024 to about 500 million gallons. Excuse me, all this is according to data from the International Air Transport Association, IATA. So, like I said, we're seeing growth. We're up to maybe 500 million gallons this year, but that's still really a drop in the bucket. About half of 1% of global jet fuel demand. So we've certainly got a long way to go to make a dent. But there have been a lot of big promises made by airlines saying that they're lining up to want to buy it. They want to buy this fuel, and as well as the Biden administration. In 2021, they put out the SAF Grand Challenge, which generated a lot of headlines, which basically set a goal of boosting SAF production to 3 billion gallons per year by 2030. So keep in mind, that's about where we are now with renewable diesel, about 3 billion gallons, and they're trying to get SAF there in a little more than 5 years. That's the goal. But again, we're a long ways away from that. You know, in 2023, California saw just 15.8 million gallons through the third quarter of last year. But you know, the growth is definitely coming. This also illustrates, Topso has this chart on their website. This is projecting global supply and demand in million metric tons over the next 25 years or so. So Topso actually projects supply to approach 120 billion gallons per year in 2050. So this is projecting incredible growth in the 2030s and 40s. A lot of change is going to have to happen to get us to this level. Some may be skeptical of, you know, seeing this kind of production growth unless we have major incentives and policy in place to make sure we get there. There's a lot of effort has been made in Europe. Can't go without mentioning that. They have taken a more mandated approach where they're going to start mandating SAF blends, I believe, next year. So that's you know, a stronger approach that people think may be more effective to just mandate the volumes, similar to how we do in the U.S. with the renewable fuel standard. But currently, the U.S. is taking a, you know, more incentive-based approach, trying to provide the tax credits or you know, the LCFS or RIN or other various components that go into that, the incentivizing. It's basically a carrot and stick approach. The U.S. is a little more carrot, trying to incentivize the, you know, moving forward. In the EU, they're a little more, you know, about the stick, I guess. But as Topso, you know, says in this quote in their report, you know, SAF supply depends heavily on government incentives in the U.S. and government mandates in the EU, and that's what we're going to need to get to these levels. Let's see. So knowing that this is all coming online, that's a big reason why OPIS decided to launch daily price assessments for both renewable diesel and SAF in December of last year. Here's a look at what our sustainable aviation fuel assessments look like on April 8th. on our brand new OPIS context platform. So you can see we publish 5 different SAF assessments, starting with 99% blends in Los Angeles and San Francisco. So those have generally hovered around a little more than $4 per gallon currently. We're basically what we've been told. We're not seeing first off, I'll tell you up front, we're not seeing a whole lot of spot market activity. The volumes that are going to California right now are pretty much strictly producer to end user. You know, a lot of these volumes have just been promised in contracts, you know, years ago, that these volumes are going directly from the producer to the end user. So they're not really reaching the spot market that OPIS kind of operates in and monitors. That is the, you know, traders and brokers that are and marketers that are dealing with fuels like gasoline, diesel, ethanol, biodiesel, whatnot. So it's been very direct. We've heard anecdotally that there's a price premium of SAF to LA jet fuel, typically around $1.50 premium or so. And there's also a cost premium of SAF to renewable diesel. So basically that's about a $2 per gallon premium. There's a buildup of costs of essentially what it would take to incentivize a producer who's currently churning out renewable diesel, what it would take them to make the switch to produce SAF instead. So under our methodology for SAF, we went with ASTM D7566 100. That's the kind of methodology for renewable diesel. It can be made from any variety of feedstocks under our methodology, and we establish a baseline CI proxy of 38.68 for SAF. So basically what that says is this is what we believe a gallon of sustainable aviation fuel costs with this CI carbon intensity score. So what a potential SAF producer or an end user could do with that is they take this $4.37 number that you see at the top of this graph, and if their CI, if their CI score of the fuel that they're using has, you know, maybe a 10 CI point improvement from our baseline, maybe they're dealing with used cooking oil SAF that has a CI score of 28, or maybe there's also some renewable natural gas involved in the production process that lowers the CI score a little bit more to 18 or whatever it may be. You can use our gallon per gallon price and add that SAF carbon intensity value that you see at the bottom of this graph that was about 0.8 of a cent currently where the LCFS values are, and multiply that to establish your own price. You know, you can kind of customize it, and it's an approach in our methodology that's worked for a long time with California ethanol, the way, you know, the market's done it for more than a decade. And when we went out to talk to stakeholders and ask them what they wanted this price to look like, this is the approach that made the most sense. So essentially those 99% assessments hold a discount that you see of about $4.37 per gallon, and then the 100% blends are around $6.92 that you see here, about a $2.55 difference. Basically that those 99% assessments hold a discount because they don't include the LCFS component, the $1 per gallon federal tax credit, or the 1.7 RINs that you would generate from producing renewable diesel. So basically, when the CI score is lower, you should be incentivized much more than that. When the CI is higher, you're not going to get the same benefit. And obviously, a big component of all of this is the price of the LCFS credit itself. So that's why we spend a lot of time in the outset of this program, this webinar, talking about the LCFS program, where it sits, how the credit prices are currently very low, because those incentives just aren't there at the moment to really incentivize the growth that's going to be needed to meet all these goals. So, for example, if LCFS credits were closer to $200 per credit, and maybe RINs were back where they were at about $2 per RIN, you'd still see the same $4.37 at the top, but instead of $6.92, it might be more like $8 or maybe even $9, and that would be meaningful, substantial margin difference for a producer of SAF. So that's what's going to really need to happen to come online to get the SAF volumes where we're at. The credit prices have got to make a lot more sense, and a lot of that goes back to the policy and implementation of the incentives that are needed. So I mentioned the dollar per credit federal tax credit. That's for renewable diesel. For sustainable aviation fuel, that gets a $1.31 per gallon federal tax credit and 1.6 D4 biomass-based diesel RINs under our methodology. So the reason it's $1.31 is because of that 38.68 proxy CI score that we've established. Basically, that CI score of 38.68 for SAF is a little different than the one for renewable diesel. I think it's 37.93. Those we were using California Air Resources Board's temporary pathway scores. So the reason it's $1.31, it's based on IRS tax guidance under the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. And amazingly, the industry is still waiting on guidance from the Treasury Department as we speak for an update on to the GREET model, which is used in determining SAF's eligibility for tax credits. And that's going to have huge implications for decades to come, how the Treasury Department decides to implement the GREET model, and how it's going to use what it's going to use for those tax incentives. There's been a lot of stakeholders in the ear of EPA, USDA, a lot of cooks in the kitchen, if you will, around this tax credit, and it's a very important development to watch. I think EPA Administrator Regan said last week that they're close, that it should be out in the next few weeks, but they've been saying that for a few months now. So it's just a kind of wait and see at this point. But taking a look at the pricing trends we've seen in the first couple months of having these new renewable diesel and SAF assessments, you can see that the differentials between how much the credits add and how much more SAF is valued over renewable diesel have been, pretty substantial. So the bottom line represents LA renewable diesel 99%. So that's the gallon of the fuel without any incentives involved. And we've been seeing that trading in the marketplace. I think last week it traded about a 30-cent discount to LA carb diesel. And once you add in all those incentives, of course, it's worth much more than the traditional value of the LA carb diesel. And that's represented in the slightly darker blue line there in the middle, the second one up just above $4 per gallon. And then the next line, that third one moving higher, is the SAF 99%, currently around, I think, like we said on the previous one, 437. And then you add in the $2.50 or whatever it is to get to that 100% blend. And those are the incentives that make a pretty big difference. But like I said, a $7 a gallon SAF returns using all those incentives isn't going to really move the needle anytime soon. If it's more around $8 or $9 per gallon, that's really going to spur the serious investment in infrastructure and change that we're going to need to see if we're going to, hit these targets. So I mentioned earlier that our price assessments at OPIS really play an important role in the market, not only because they help renewable diesel producers and SAF producers figure out how much their RINs and LCFS credits are worth, and not only because they help refiners understand how much compliance under the RFS and LCFS will cost them, but also because our OPIS RIN and LCFS assessments serve as the benchmark price assessments for the futures contracts listed on the Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE. So RIN futures on ICE had a huge year in 2023, surging to 7.6 billion RINs traded. That was up from just 1.6 billion in 2022. So clearly, and they're off to a hot start again this year, as the first few months, I think January's volumes doubled the year ago January total. There's been a lot more activity on the ICE RINs futures screen. And it's been a really interesting development because it allows either the obligated parties that need to buy their RINs to be compliant, or the fuels producers that are going to be generating these RINs. It allows them to really hedge in their future and lock in margins, out as far as they want to go out into the future. And we're really excited to announce that there will be futures contracts launched on April 22nd for our renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel price assessments. So starting in, I guess, just 11 days, you can log into ICE and trade futures against our daily price assessments for LA renewable diesel, the 99% blend. They're also offering LA renewable diesel 99% versus the heating oil, as well as LA SAF 99% and LA SAF 99% against heating oil as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what that new dynamic, how that will play a role in the price discovery process for us, how much activity we're seeing around renewable diesel and SAF, and we're excited to get it out there. And if you have any questions about the RIN futures on ICE, I always send them to ICE's Director of Refined Products and RINs, Michael Rapace, who does a really phenomenal job of driving traffic to their screen. So if you've enjoyed this webinar so far, and hopefully you have, maybe you just enjoy topics like this, but not so much the webinar, that's okay. There are more people out there who are just like you, hundreds in fact. You can join us at an upcoming OPIS event where we assemble an agenda of a wide variety of industry perspectives talking about the hottest topics in biofuels. The content is always on point and the networking is even better. So hopefully we'll see you at our 16th annual OPIS RFS RINs and Biofuels Forum in Chicago from September 23rd to 25th, or maybe at the 13th annual OPIS LCFS and Carbon Markets Workshop in San Diego next January. So with that, I think that was pretty much all I had, and I'll go ahead and open it up to questions.
All right, Jordan, very well done. Thank you for that excellent presentation. We will now move into our Q&A. If you have a question, you may submit it anytime in the question box. So Jordan, I'm going to go back to our very first question, which is, does fuel oil generated from waste tires using pyrolysis meet the SAF criteria? And similarly, does pyrolytic oil produced from plastic wastes meet the SAF definition?
Oh man, that's a fantastic question. I don't know the answer. I'll tell you from the start, but I would probably reach out to maybe a third-party verifier would probably be the best person to talk to about that. You could also look on the California Air Resources Board website, or for example, the Oregon Clean Fuels Program or the Washington Clean Fuels Standard. They all have websites where they publicly list all of their pathways that have been approved. So that could be a good place to start to see if there's already been a similar pathway approved for SAF from, I don't even remember all the fuel oil from waste tires through
And plastic.
pyrolysis. You could,
Yeah.
yeah, you could see if this has been approved yet, if anyone's doing it currently, or you could, you know, like I said, reach out to a third-party verifier, someone who could maybe prepare a pathway application and go through that process. I've been told it typically takes about 6 months to a year, maybe on the longer side if it's a new process for the state agencies to go through those and approve them. But it's obviously, you know, worth going through it, and a lot of people have proved that when you have a fuel with a low CI, you should be, you know, incentivized properly.
Great advice. All right, our next question is, yesterday CARB implied that credit prices don't impact retail fuel prices, but you seem to suggest they do. What is wrong with CARB's analysis?
That's a great question. There's been a lot of debate and discussion around how these compliance credits are passed on to the consumer. A lot of times refiners have tried to say that they eat those costs, that they have to pay the cost of compliance. But at the same time, we're aware of plenty of refiners who invoice, who use our assessments and include that on the invoice, what the credit costs them to comply, whether it's the LCFS, the RIN, cap at the rack. There's a various, you know, of these programs where they have to buy these credits to comply, and we publish the cost of compliance. And we hear anecdotally that it is included on invoices. It's passed down to from the, you know, refiner, the fuel producer, down to the retailer or the blender, the jobber. It makes its way all the way down to the consumer, as far as we know, and we have kind of heard anecdotally that they are included on invoices. So otherwise, you know, it seems, if I were a refiner, you know, it seems like it'd be pretty crazy to just eat that compliance cost when you could certainly include it on invoicing in the cost of your fuel. You know, for example, when crude oil goes from $50 a barrel to $100 a barrel, they're not, you know, invoicing for $50 per barrel anymore. They're invoicing for, you know, what they paid for it. So I think it's definitely different from one party to the next, but I think for a regulator to say that it's not being passed down to the consumer is probably not accurate.
All right. Next question is, even with the LCFS step down, can the surplus or green line be reduced significantly?
Oh, that's the kind of $1 million question or $1 billion question in the marketplace right now. And a lot of people have different views depending on what traders, you know, or analysts that we talk to. A lot of people have different views and opinions on this. But depending on how stringent CARB comes out and finalizes the proposal, they have quite a juggling act before they can finalize this and send it to their executive board for a vote. But if they were to, you know, make the program more stringent, we can certainly see that cumulative credit banks start to wither away pretty quickly, especially if they go, for example, for the 9% step down mechanism, and we kind of accelerate even further into the future of the compliance schedule, and it suddenly gets a lot more difficult to comply, we could definitely see that cumulative credit bank wither away. It's just a matter of how fast that'll happen, I think. I don't think it's going to happen in the next year or two, but it could certainly happen in the next 5 years.
Okay, next question.
Mhm.
ASTM only permits max 50% SAF blends. Can you expand on how you define the 99% and the 100% blends?
I'm not 100% sure. I didn't mean to, pardon the pun. I'm not 100% sure how what the current regulations are, how it varies, state to state or nationally or country to country. We just know that in kind of the wholesale like bulk price that we assess, it's often a 99% blend where it's been splash blended with a little bit of traditional fossil fuel for the various tax credit and LCFS RIN credit purposes. That's not to say that that's the blend that will go into the, plane at the airport. It's probably a much lower blend, but that's just where we're assessing it like at the wholesale level. And then from there, the blender can kind of make their own decisions how they want to blend it beyond that.
Okay, the next question is, won't Brazilian ethanol simply be imported to the chagrin of US corn farmers?
Yeah, I mean, that's been something that that was an early concern of the LCFS program early on, to meet the early targets in the early years of the LCFS program. California definitely needed large shipments of sugarcane ethanol from Brazil, but we haven't seen that in quite some time now. I don't think we've seen meaningful imports from Brazil for more than 2 or 3 years now. We've been in a little bit of a trade war with them over our ethanol. I think they've implemented a tariff of around 20%, I think, on imports of US ethanol because they were getting so much of our corn ethanol sent down there. But nowadays, I think the trade flows have really dried up. There's not a ton of sugarcane ethanol coming into California or vice versa. We're not sending much corn ethanol to them. We're kind of on cold terms, I guess, right now. But as if the LCFS program were to suddenly get more, stringent, and we had a scenario where, I don't know, the corn crops struggled, and maybe that, sent ethanol to a very pricey level where it made sense to import Brazilian ethanol, we could definitely see that open up again. I think the last time there were really substantial volumes was when we had a pretty major drought. That's been nearly a decade ago now. So, long story short, yes, we could see that, but a lot would have to break just right to get us to that level.
Okay. The next question is, what would be the blend, for example, 70/30 for the $2 per gallon premium?
I'm not 100% sure what blend they're talking about there. The 70, could you repeat the question maybe?
It says it's from Deep Single. Deep, perhaps if you're still on, you can clarify. His question is, what would be the blend, for example, 70/30 for the $2 per gallon premium?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on that. Or
Why don't
what
we,
that $2.
yeah, why don't we
Mhm.
pause that? Oh, okay,
Okay.
he's responded. Blend of SAF versus Jet A, he says.
Okay. Yeah, oh, for that $2 premium that I mentioned. Yeah, so
Mhm.
we've just kind of heard anecdotally that SAF is the very limited number of SAF producers are selling to end users at a differential to LA jet fuel, and that's been around $2 per gallon. I would guess that if it were a 70/30 blend, it'd probably be I'm assuming that means 70% jet fuel, 30% SAF, it would probably be less than that $2 premium. But again, that's we just really kind of look at the wholesale level kind of before these blends happen. It's typically how we price this kind of spot market. Not sure if that helps, probably not, but be happy to have a longer conversation if needed.
Sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next question is, you mentioned a majority of SAF going from producers to end markets or airlines via contract. Not spot, but who is blending the SAF?
Good question. I think there are a few airports that have, SAF agreements in place where they have an agreement with, say, a producer to supply them with X amount of, fuel per year. I think a few of the airlines have tried to do the same, where they've announced that they've, had partnerships with SAF producers. And that's pretty much my understanding of how most of the transactions have happened to date. The kind of spot market, quote unquote, that I've been talking about, that's that OPIS really monitors. That's typically gallons that maybe weren't already promised a home. They, a producer makes it or maybe sends it to a marketer, and then they try and find the best home for it in terms of where it's most financially incentivized, where it makes the most sense to send it. But a lot of it for SAF to date has just been those sort of offtake agreements that have been announced in press releases, and a lot of those agreements are in place before a single drop of SAF is even produced. We've seen a lot of these promises made, 10-year, 30-year agreement, 20-year agreements, or whatever it may be, where they haven't even really started producing yet, but they're already saying, okay, whatever we produce, it's going to that guy because he's going to pay us X amount. That's just kind of the infancy stage of the kind of market development where we're at right now with SAF.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question. You explain the price spread between SAF 100% and SAF 99%. What explains the price spread between SAF 99% and normal jet fuel?
Oh yeah, great question. So that is I guess just kind of a cost of production. I'm not exactly sure what goes into that $1.50 premium that we've heard anecdotally from SAF producers and end users. What's exactly built into that premium, but that's just what we've heard in the marketplace. Again, that could evolve. We used to hear renewable diesel trading at a premium to LA carb diesel, for example, but now it's trading at a discount. So that could be something that we could see, evolve, or maybe that premium comes off a bit as there's more SAF production. But as you saw on that top SO graphic, they're expecting demand to outpace supply for a long, long time to come, pretty much all the way to 2050. There's going to be more airlines and mandated volumes needed than there is production capacity online to be able to supply it.
All right. Next question is, do you see the Scope 3 market evolving to support the SAF market price for producers?
I'm sorry, I'll be honest, I don't know much about the Scope 3 market, so I can't really
Okay.
speak to that one. I'm sorry.
All right. No problem. Next question, it says, in most offtake agreements, do you see the producer or airline monetizing and taking the credit risk for the incentives?
That's a great question, and that's kind of a kind of an awkward place where we're at in that market right now. I think we've heard through the grapevine that maybe the airlines have been a little more stingy, you know, in terms of not wanting to pay the cost premium that it would take to take on SAF. Frankly, it costs a lot more to make SAF right now than traditional jet fuel. So that's why these incentives like cap at the rack, LCFS, RIN, tax credit, all these things are needed to even try and level the playing field, and it's still not quite there. We've also heard that there are people working on these sort of certificates where, you know, for example, when you go to buy your airline ticket, it may give you an option of would you like to add X amount to the cost of your ticket to, you know, offset your carbon footprint or whatever it may be, to kind of ask the consumer to voluntarily help pay for the cost of the SAF. That could be a development that we'll see over the next 5 years or so. It wouldn't surprise me at all. But yeah, that's just kind of where it's at the moment. But it's still kind of in a strange standstill because there's just not a lot of production capacity online right now, and neither side really has a ton of leverage in the negotiation of it.
All right, we'll do a couple more questions, Jordan.
Right.
The next one is, although many claim the $1.75 SAF production tax credit, in reality, current commercial technology allows for at best about 85 cents per gallon with 100% UCO at 18 CI. Do you see it differently?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds right. I don't know the exact you know, number that the SAF producer could, you know, theoretically recoup. But that sounds right and makes sense. Ours is, for our proxy CI score that I mentioned, around 38. You're only getting $1.31 of that $1.75. So it's definitely definitely has to be a very, very low CI to get that full benefit. And even that, it's probably not enough to really move the needle and encourage the kind of growth in production capacity that we've seen in renewable diesel over the last 5 years.
All right, next question is, it says, curious on pricing. You are comparing it to RD. I'm assuming she must mean SAF, but ETJ is a D5 RIN, so how would that pricing look?
I'm not sure. I think basically the reason we've been given this sort of cost premium to renewable diesel is frankly because there's not a lot of SAF production online at the moment, and you just it's a kind of good way to gauge the value of SAF by looking at what it would cost a renewable diesel producer to switch. So that's why we're kind of been pricing SAF at that $2 per gallon premium. But we could definitely see that start to come off, you know, as more volumes come online, or maybe it gets incentivized a different way. And yeah, that's the methodology that you mentioned with the D5 RIN. We went with the D4 just because it was the predominant RIN being generated by SAF to date. But if the market evolves a different way and we need to go back and, you know, change our methodology, we can certainly do that because we want our price to reflect, you know, what the market is trading and producing and the way the market is behaving. So you know, OPIS has always been very conversational with market stakeholders to make sure, you know, our methodology and pricing reflects you know, how the market is actually trading.
All right, next question is, can RINs generated through SAF production be sold in advance, and is it recognized by the IRA?
Oh man, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I do think first off, we do hear of RINs being sold ahead of time. For example, yesterday we heard you know, D3 RINs for 2025 compliance trade. And obviously, no 2025 D3 RINs have been generated yet because we're still in 2024. That definitely happens in the marketplace, people selling ahead of time. And you could probably start to see SAF producers doing that as well, trying to trade ahead. And like I said, also definitely worth mentioning the RIN futures as well. Gives people a kind of a hedging tool to be able to go out and buy or sell RINs at a future date. For example, if a SAF producer knows they're not going to be online, if they're building their plant right now and they know they're not going to be online until 2027, you can go on the ICE screen and try and offer RINs. As far as I understand, you can, go on there and try and offer the RINs in the future, but you'll just obviously be expected to deliver on those.
All right. Next question, which feedstock or SAF process do you think has the highest likelihood of growing SAF volumes?
Oh, I love that question. Well, the corn industry, big corn and ethanol is very powerful, and they're making a strong push to make alcohol to jet, a major thing. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Maybe I have just attended too many ethanol conferences in the past few months, but we've heard a lot of rhetoric around alcohol to jet and ethanol as the feedstock. And it does make sense in the sense that renewable diesel is currently dominating the feedstock market, and it's probably going to be that way for a couple more years to come. All the used cooking oil, waste fats, all the low CI stuff is going to renewable diesel. If it made sense for it to go to SAF production instead, we could definitely see that. But I don't want to pick favorites, but I could definitely see alcohol to jet ethanol feedstock being a major feedstock 5 years from now.
All right. Does OPIS have any offerings to download or subscribe to a data feed for LCFS or RIN pricing or historical data?
Absolutely. And I feel like I should, if I have any OPIS sales people or customer service people or marketing people, they're probably screaming at the screen right now because I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I believe you'll be getting an email after this presentation for how you can subscribe for our free trial. So that's probably how I should have answered it from the start. You're going to get an email that gives you a link to get I think a 30-day trial or whatever it may be to our assessments and whatnot. And feel free to check us out and see if you like our pricing and news, and we can go from there. But yeah, I'm kind of more on the editorial side, so I'm not involved in those sales, but definitely be looking out for that email.
All right, awesome. Well, we still have quite a few questions, but we do have a hard stop time here coming up. So I want to assure everyone that your questions remaining will be sent to Jordan, and he will be able to follow up with them after the webinar. He will have your contact information. And a recording of this will be available at safmagazine.com under the events tab. Jordan, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. To our attendees, be sure to check out our upcoming conferences where producers always get in free. And on behalf of SAF Magazine and OPIS, we want to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much. Be well.